If you're over 60 and still regularly adding cheese to your meals, you're not alone. In a national health survey, over 85% of older Americans eat cheese at least twice a week. But here's what most people don't realize. Some seemingly harmless cheese choices may be silently harming your heart, blood pressure, and overall longevity. No one's saying you have to give up cheese entirely. In fact, certain types can support bone health, improve digestion, and even lower your risk of heart disease. But to get those benefits, you need to know which ones to choose and which ones to avoid. At the Elderly Way, we spend time digging into trusted data, not unverified internet trends, to help you make smarter nutritional decisions. And today, we're going to walk you through 4 types of cheese you should include in your weekly diet if you want to stay healthy, strong, and mentally sharp after 60. 4 types of cheese you should cut out as soon as possible, especially if you're concerned about stroke risk, high blood pressure, or cholesterol. Now think about this: is your favorite cheese on the danger list? And what about the healthiest option? Maybe it's one you've never even noticed at the grocery store. Tell us in the comments, where are you from? How old are you? And which cheese can you not live without? We at the Elderly Way read every comment, and you just might be featured in our next Q&A video. If you found this helpful, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It's the easiest way to help us keep creating more content for the senior community, from nutrition and exercise to memory improvement. All right, let's start the countdown. We'll kick things off with the healthiest cheese for older adults and why you should try it this week. 4. Aged Gouda, a smart choice for healthy aging. Once you pass age 60, one of the most important things you can do for your body is to choose foods that support your heart, bones, and digestive system. Among the cheeses that can help aged Gouda, that is, Gouda cheese aged for at least 18 months, stands out as a top contender. Unlike soft or freshly made cheeses, long-aged Gouda undergoes a complex transformation. Its proteins break down into smaller chains called peptides, which are much easier for older adults to absorb. As digestive enzyme levels naturally decline with age, this isn't just helpful, it's essential for getting enough protein without overburdening the stomach. But what truly makes aged Gouda worth noting is another component: vitamin K2. Vitamin K2 is a fat-soluble nutrient rarely found in processed foods, but it plays a critical role in directing calcium to the right places, your bones and teeth, instead of letting it build up in your arteries. Epidemiological studies in Japan and the Netherlands have shown that people who get enough daily K2 have higher bone density, fewer fractures, and even a lower risk of dying from heart disease. Just one small serving, about 28 grams, 1 ounce of aged Gouda, provides nearly 75 micrograms of vitamin K2, enough to make a real difference when part of a consistent diet. On top of that, this cheese also contains CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, a natural fatty acid shown to have mild anti-inflammatory effects, support lipid metabolism, and possibly benefit immune regulation. Another perk: the extended aging process removes almost all the lactose, making aged Gouda a viable option for people with mild lactose intolerance, a common issue among middle-aged and older adults. An often overlooked bonus is the presence of postbiotics, the final metabolic byproducts of beneficial bacteria formed during the long aging process. While the term may be unfamiliar to many consumers, science is beginning to recognize the role of postbiotics in maintaining the gut's immune barrier and even influencing nervous system responses via the gut-brain axis. To get the most nutritional value out of aged Gouda, let it come to room temperature before eating. This improves nutrient absorption and brings out the full depth of its flavor. Pairing it with a few apple slices or whole grain crackers is a simple way to balance the taste while also adding fiber to aid digestion. Of course, moderation remains key. Like all hard cheeses, aged Gouda contains sodium and saturated fat, so a sensible serving for older adults would be around 1 to 1.5 ounces per sitting, and there's no need to eat it every day. Aged Gouda isn't a miracle food, but in a world where nutrition for older adults is becoming more personalized and sustainability-focused, it's a choice worth considering. Delicious, practical, and genuinely beneficial for long-term health. Just make sure you're choosing a variety aged at least 18 months, free from unnecessary additives, and eating it in moderation. It could be one of those small but powerful changes that make a real difference as you age. Number 3. Parmigiano Reggiano. More than just cheese, it's a complete nutritional powerhouse for people 60 plus. When people think of Italian cheese, Parmesan often comes to mind. But not all Parmesan is created equal. The real deal, Parmigiano Reggiano, is produced in specific regions of northern Italy using a traditional method that's nearly 900 years old. And that makes a big difference, not just in flavor but in nutritional value. After age 60, efficiently absorbing protein becomes crucial to maintaining muscle mass, physical strength, and recovery after illness. Parmigiano Reggiano delivers about 10 grams of protein per ounce, around 28 g, but what sets it apart is the form of that protein. Thanks to its long aging process, minimum 12 months, sometimes up to 36, the protein is naturally broken down through hydrolysis into amino acids and small peptides. For older adults, this eases the digestive load and boosts absorption, a major advantage over most other high-protein foods. Beyond protein, Parmigiano Reggiano is also an impressive source of calcium, with more than 300 mg per ounce, even more than a standard glass of milk. What's even more important is the ideal ratio of calcium to phosphorus and magnesium, which maximizes absorption. According to research from Italian universities, the bioavailability of calcium in Parmigiano Reggiano is nearly 100%, compared to just 20–40% from most calcium supplements. But it doesn't stop there. This cheese contains all 9 essential amino acids, a rare trait for non-meat foods, which is great news for older adults cutting back on red meat due to heart concerns. It also provides significant amounts of trace minerals like zinc and selenium, both vital for immune function and thyroid health. Other fascinating compounds in Parmesan include casomorphins, naturally occurring peptides linked to mood regulation, relaxation, and better sleep, and tyrosine, a precursor to dopamine and norepinephrine, which help with alertness and focus. This may explain why many people feel noticeably better after a meal that includes Parmesan. It's also worth noting that Parmigiano Reggiano is naturally lactose-free. Thanks to its extended aging process, the lactose is fully broken down, making it suitable for most people with lactose intolerance. It's one of the few cheeses that are both nutrient-dense and gentle on the digestive system, especially important for older adults. How to use it? Parmigiano Reggiano is best enjoyed the traditional way, broken into small chunks with a special knife, not shredded. This preserves the natural crystal structure developed during aging. Eating a small portion after meals can aid digestion, while delivering protein and minerals at the time your body absorbs them best. Pairing it with a few drops of aged balsamic vinegar can even boost the absorption of minerals like zinc and magnesium. Of course, like all cheeses, Parmigiano Reggiano does contain some saturated fat and sodium. But in moderation, about 1 ounce per serving, 2 to 3 times a week, its benefits far outweigh the risks, especially if you're looking for a natural, digestible source of nutrients that supports bone, muscle, and nervous system health. With its transparent production, no artificial additives, and a protected, legally recognized traditional process, Parmigiano Reggiano isn't just a food. It's a smart, proactive nutritional strategy for healthy aging. Number 2. Grass-fed raw cheddar, a balanced choice between tradition and bioactive benefits for older adults. Many of us are familiar with cheddar cheese as part of our daily meals, but few realize that the origin of the milk and the way it's initially processed make a significant difference in terms of nutrition and health benefits. Once you reach your 60s and beyond, these differences become more important than ever. One standout option in this category is raw cheddar made from grass-fed cow's milk, a more nutrient-dense, digestion-friendly version that, according to numerous studies, offers genuine long-term health advantages. Milk from grass-fed cows has a superior nutritional profile compared to milk from conventionally raised cows. It contains higher levels of natural anti-inflammatory compounds like omega-3s, CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, and especially fat-soluble vitamins such as A, D, E, and K2. When this kind of milk is used to make cheese without pasteurization, meaning it retains its original beneficial enzymes and bacteria, and is then aged under proper hygienic conditions for at least 60 days, in accordance with U.S. food safety regulations. The final product is a raw cheese that's highly nutritious and significantly easier to digest. For older adults, what's especially important is that this type of cheddar contains vitamin K2 in the MK4 form, which has the highest bioavailability. MK4 has been shown to help prevent arterial calcification and enhance calcium transport into bones. Combined with the natural vitamin D found in milk from grass-fed cows, K2 helps support bone and joint health, a major concern after age 60, particularly for those at risk of osteoporosis or who have experienced falls. Additionally, raw cheddar provides native digestive enzymes, the very ones that are typically destroyed during conventional pasteurization. These enzymes not only help break down proteins and fats more efficiently, but also reduce the workload on the pancreas. In later years, as the body's natural enzyme production gradually declines, food-based enzymes become a valuable source of support. Another notable benefit is the presence of beneficial bacteria, probiotics, in raw cheddar. These can help maintain a healthy gut microbiome. Certain strains of probiotics found in raw cheese can even produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which have been shown to play a key role in reducing gut inflammation and maintaining a strong mucosal barrier. This isn't just about digestion. Recent studies have also highlighted the gut-brain axis, showing how microbiome quality can directly affect mood, memory, and even sleep, all of which are vital elements of quality of life in retirement. That said, to fully benefit from raw cheddar, it's important to use it properly. Raw cheese should not be heated to high temperatures. Ideally, it should be kept below 120 degrees F, about 49 degrees C, to avoid destroying the beneficial enzymes and bacteria. A simple approach is to take it out of the fridge 20-30 minutes before eating and enjoy it as is, or add it to cold salads or sandwiches. Pairing it with fermented foods like sauerkraut or mild kimchi can amplify the probiotic effect and further aid digestion thanks to additional compounds like lactic acid and soluble fiber. Of course, since this is still a hard cheese, raw cheddar contains a fair amount of saturated fat and sodium. Older adults should watch their portion sizes, typically 1.5 to 2 ounces per serving, no more than 3 times per week, especially if managing blood pressure or following a low-saturated fat diet. Overall, grass-fed raw cheddar is a highly worthwhile combination of familiar flavor and targeted bioactive benefits. It offers more than just energy or richness. It provides real support for healthy aging, from cardiovascular and bone health to digestion and cognitive function. In a world where food is increasingly overprocessed, this is a rare example of tradition, when done right, still holding a strong place in a modern nutritional strategy for older adults. Number 1. Swiss Gruyere, the perfect cheese for heart, bones, memory, and digestion after age 60. Among the many types of cheese found on supermarket shelves, only a select few can truly satisfy the taste buds while delivering clear, consistent, and targeted nutritional benefits for older adults. Gruyere, a traditional Swiss cheese, is one of those rare exceptions. While it's not as commonly found in the U.S. as cheddar or mozzarella, Gruyere is highly regarded by nutritionists and geriatric health researchers, and the reasons behind that make it well worth your attention. Gruyere is made from raw milk sourced from pasture-raised cows grazing in the Swiss Alps, where a rich variety of vegetation leads to milk that contains significantly higher levels of micronutrients and antioxidants. This helps define the cheese's unique nutritional profile, a natural blend of easily digestible proteins, balanced minerals, beneficial bacteria, and anti-inflammatory bioactive compounds, all of which are extremely well suited to the metabolic needs and tissue protective demands of people over 60. One of Gruyère's standout benefits is its ability to support the body's production of glutathione, the most powerful antioxidant your body makes on its own. Glutathione plays a central role in detoxification, cellular protection, and immune regulation. As we age, our ability to synthesize glutathione declines significantly, leaving cells more vulnerable to oxidative stress, infections, and low-grade chronic inflammation. Gruyere contains high levels of glutathione precursors such as cysteine and glycine, amino acids that help the body maintain and boost production of this vital antioxidant. Unlike glutathione supplements, which tend to have poor bioavailability, Gruyere provides a much more sustainable and natural source. On top of that, Gruyere offers a generous dose of vitamin B12, a water-soluble vitamin essential for nervous system function, red blood cell formation, and memory support. B12 deficiency is common among older adults due to reduced absorption through the digestive tract, and when left undetected, it can lead to fatigue, anxiety, and even reversible dementia-like symptoms. Just a small serving of Gruyere can cover most of the daily B12 requirement, and its fat-rich structure makes it easier to absorb. In addition to these micronutrients, Gruyere is also rich in phosphorus, zinc, and selenium, three minerals essential for bone health, immune defense, and proper thyroid function. Its protein content rivals that of lean meats, but has the added advantage of being naturally broken down through long fermentation. This means older adults can absorb the amino acids without overburdening the stomach. One lesser-known but highly valuable aspect of Gruyere is the presence of Propionibacterium freudenreichii, a bacterial strain responsible for the tiny holes characteristic of Swiss cheeses. These bacteria produce propionic acid during fermentation, a compound shown in multiple studies to reduce inflammation, lower LDL cholesterol, and even suppress cancer cell growth in lab settings. Propionic acid also helps protect the gut lining, improves digestion, and creates a more favorable environment for other beneficial gut bacteria. A final but equally important advantage is that Gruyere contains lactopeptides, compounds that have been studied for their ability to help mildly lower blood pressure by inhibiting the enzyme ACE, angiotensin-converting enzyme. This is the same mechanism behind many blood pressure medications, though lactopeptides act in a gentler, more natural way. For people with prehypertension or those on low-dose medications, adding Gruyere in moderation could offer additional support without risk of interaction. In terms of how to use it, Gruyere is best enjoyed cold or lightly melted into soups, never boiled, since high heat can break down protein structures and reduce the bioavailability of its nutrients. A reasonable serving size is about 1 to 1.5 ounces, 2 to 3 times per week. Pairing it with whole grain bread or fiber-rich foods can help enhance absorption of B vitamins and stabilize blood sugar levels after meals. In summary, Gruyere isn't the most visible cheese on the shelf, but once you understand its nutritional profile, it clearly deserves a spot on the priority list for aging adults. Rich in easily digestible protein, packed with essential minerals, and supportive of everything from heart and bones to brain and gut health, Gruyere is proof that traditional foods, when made the right way, still belong in a proactive wellness strategy after 60. You've just gone with us through the 4 best types of cheese that people over 60 should consider adding to their weekly diet. From pure Parmesan, aged Gouda, raw grass-fed cheddar, to Swiss Gruyere, each brings its own unique benefits, from supporting heart health and improving bone density to nourishing the digestive system and protecting cognitive function. What they all have in common is that they're rich in natural nutrients, easier to digest, and especially well suited to the changing physiological needs that come with age. You may have heard that cheese is something to limit after 60, but as you've just seen, that's not entirely true. The issue isn't cheese itself, it's about which kind you choose. If you choose the right ones, eat in moderation, and understand your body, cheese can be more than just a favorite food. It can be a positive part of a healthy, long life strategy. But that's only half the picture. While the cheeses we just talked about can help you stay healthy in the long run, there are still a few other types, more common than you might think, that could be quietly harming your heart, brain, and blood sugar. In fact, a few of them might already be sitting in your fridge right now. So don't miss the next part of this video. In part 2, the elderly way will help you clearly identify 4 types of cheese that older adults should avoid, not to create fear, but to help you make smart, body-conscious decisions. If you found the information in this video helpful, take a second to hit like so the algorithm knows that senior health is something worth spreading. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next installment. And if you have a loved one, a friend, or a companion who's 60 or older, share this video with them. Sometimes one small tip can change a whole eating habit and change the entire rest of a life. See you in part 2, where we'll take a closer look at the types of cheese you should remove from your plate before they quietly take a toll on your future health. This is the elderly way. Living long isn't just luck, it's the result of the right choices, starting today.